Continuing on with our discussion of the true God, Allah, we will now discuss the Israelites. This ancient cult took many guises throughout the centuries. In the West, it has survived as a number of secret societies, talking about the Israelites, most notably the Rosicrucians, the Freemasons, and its various fringe organizations. But what all these numerous secret societies have in common is an adherence to what is called the Kabbalah. And in this sense is a false version of the true Kabbalah. Because this is a Jewish adaptation of the ancient worship of the dying God. Though Allah sent Moses to the Israelites to guide them to the straight path, they rebelled incessantly. This began with the worship of the golden calf, the basis of the name of Surat al-Baqarah, or the cow, which took place soon after their exodus from Egypt. Scholars have recognized that this calf was the Apis bull, belonging to the worship of Osiris, the Egyptian version of the dying god. The worship of the dying god was further reinforced when the Israelites entered the land of the Canaanites, who worshiped a version of the dying god and goddess, Baal and Astarte. The Israelites were required to conquer their land. Various hints in the Bible suggest that the Canaanites were descendants of the Anakim, in other words, the fallen angels, and the female descendants of Cain. The Israelites were also commanded to avoid imitating their cult or intermarrying with them, and yet they committed both incessantly. The entire nation became committed to Canaanite paganism to an extent that even the sacred temple itself was polluted with the trappings of the worship of the dying god and goddess. These were represented as pillars, which were to symbolize the phallus of the god, entwined by a serpent known as Asherah poles. There were figures of the constellations, and the god was figured as riding on a chariot. In addition, they often practiced child sacrifice dedicated to Moloch, or Saturn. God purposely gave bad laws which discouraged life and made them offer gifts of their firstborn by fire. All this was to horrify them and show them he is the Lord. We can presume that God gave these bad laws to Moses too. Moreover, I gave them statutes that were not good and ordinances by which they could not have life. And I defiled them through their very gifts in making them offer by fire all their firstborn, that I might horrify them. I did it that they might know that I am the Lord. That's from Ezekiel chapter 20, verses 25 and 26. The true Judaism of Moses was only practiced by a handful of Orthodox reformers. It was such that numerous warnings were pronounced against the Israelites, warning that if they did not desist from their idolatry, God would send their enemies to punish them. That is exactly what happened when first in the 8th century BC, the Assyrians captured the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom of Israel and dispersed the Israelites among the Medes in northern Iran and Armenia. From then on, Armenia would continue to figure prominently in the history of the occult. Although the 10 tribes have popularly been considered lost ever since in ancient Jewish sources, their existence was well known. They were believed to have migrated to Armenia and from there to southern Russia, to the land of the Scythians, which the ancient Jewish scholar Josephus and others had identified as the descendants of Gog and Magog. Certain etymologies propose that the word Scythians from Sake in turn is derived from the Isaac sons or sons of Isaac. Isaac, the son of Abraham and brother to Ishmael, had two sons, Jacob or Israel who became the ancestor of the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob's other son was Esau, the forefather of the Edomites. Esau was a red-haired, or red all over like a hairy garment, and called Edom, which means red. Likewise, the Scythians, according to Herodotus, have all deep blue eyes and bright red hair, and practice mystery rites dedicated to Bacchus, a Greek version of Baal. The legend persisted, such that during the Middle Ages, German Jews regarded southern Russia and Central Asia as the location of the lost tribe, known to them as Red Jews, and continued to be identified with Gog and Magog. In the history of the nation of archers by Armenian historian of the 13th century, Grigor Achener, corroborated the legend of the Scythians were Edomites. The Esavites, who are the Scythians, descended from Esau, son of Isaac. They are black, wild, and strange looking. From them descended the Boromich and the Lexic, who dwell in holes and traps and perpetrate many crimes. And it is said that the Edomites, who are the Franks, also are descended from him. These three peoples, descendants of Hagar, Keturah, and Esau, mingled together and gave birth to another people, strange looking and wicked, called Tatar, or Mongols, which means sharp and light. Finally, between 598 and 596 BC, Nebuchadnezzar captured Jerusalem, sacked the famous Temple of Solomon, and deported much of the remaining population to Babylon. The Jews would eventually remain in Babylon for half a century, a period known as the exile, until their release in 538 BC, when nearly 50,000 of them returned to Jerusalem. It was in that century that certain Jews developed the Kabbalah, a false version of it, mind you. The Jews were supposed to have regarded the exile as a fulfilled prophecy and a reminder to abandon their pagan ways and return to the pure message of Moses. However, a number amongst them seemed to have been unwilling to abandon this paganism and instead incorporated it into their interpretation of Judaism. They took the notion of being God's chosen people to mean they were destined for paradise, despite what they did, and that the exile was merely a temporary punishment. Instead, they came to believe God would eventually return them to the promised land, or Zion, at the end of time, with the advent of their promised Messiah, who would rebuild the temple and make them rulers of the world. Most important, this Messiah was to be the son of David, descended from the royal kingly line of Judah. However, from the earliest times, the Israelites intermarried extensively with the Canaanites, and therefore were considered, according to Kabbalistic interpretation, to also have descended from the Anakim, or the fallen angels. That is, the Shayatin. From them, this bloodline inherited certain occult powers, which were called its sacred character, and it was therefore necessary to carefully guard it through extensive intermarriage, a practice that was maintained through the centuries and was hidden in the aristocratic families of Europe. This early form of Zionism was also merged with the ancient pagan beliefs and magic of dying god worship to become the Kabbalah. The adoption of magic by the Jews of Babylon is mentioned in the Quran, Surah al-Baqarah 101 and 102. And whenever a messenger from Allah comes to them to confirm what they already have, a group from those who were given the book threw the book of Allah behind themselves as if they did not know it. And they followed that which the Shayatin ascribed to the kingdom of Solomon. Yet Solomon did not reject the guidance, that is, but the devils rejected it, teaching people magic and that which had been revealed to the two angels in Babylon, Harut and Marut. And the two did not teach anyone without saying, "We are a test, so don't reject the guidance." So they learned from them how to split a man from his wife, but they cannot harm anybody with it except by Allah's permission. And they learn what harms them and does not benefit them. And they knew already that whoever sells out to who will have no share in the hereafter. Bad is what they sold themselves for if they knew. The influence of the false Kabbalists in Babylon in the century led to the development of the astrology and numerology, which the Chaldean Magi Magi of Babylon became famous for. In fact, in the book of Daniel, chapter 2, verse 48, Daniel was made chief of the wise men in Babylon, that is, of the Magi of Chaldean, and yet supposedly remains faithful to the laws of his own religion. In 538 BC, Cyrus the Great led the Persians and conquered Babylon from the Assyrians and allowed the Jews to leave and return to their homeland. While many returned to Israel, many of the early Jewish Kabbalists dispersed to different parts of the world, resulting in the spread of false Kabbalistic doctrines to these areas. The ancient world at this time knew nothing of the Jews as a separate ethnic identity, but instead knew them as the Chaldean Magi. They were falsely regarded as being priests of the Persian religion of Zoroastrianism, founded by Zoroaster. However, the Magi that became popular for their wisdom throughout the ancient world were not Zoroastrian, but followed a number of doctrines that were the origin of the false Kabbalah. Though they were often falsely attributed to Zoroaster, rather, they practiced the occult rites and magic of the same ancient paganism, but in their case, dedicated to a Persian version of the dying god named Mithras. Shortly, it will be demonstrated the secret behind Shaitan and the Jinn being written in this short history of how Islam was hijacked. Plato, let's discuss Plato. Where the greatest influence of these magi was exerted was in ancient Greece, where it contributed to the emergence of what is known as philosophy. The first Greek philosophers, known as pre-Socratic, all emerged in the region of Ionia, now northwestern Turkey, which was then under Persian occupation, and a Greek historian named Cherilus, who was a contemporary of Herodotus, maintained that the Jews had come to the assistance of Xerxes in his expedition against Greece. If they practiced the secret arts of the early Kabbalah, they would have been known as Magi. Perhaps one of the reasons these early Kabbalist Jews ventured to Greece was for the known reason that this territory had already been an important Jewish settlement. Early Greek civilization was a result of contact with the Phoenicians, who introduced them to the alphabet, which still resounds with the two first letters of the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph and Bet. For the most part, the nation of Israel did not adhere to the Mosaic faith, but to the pagan cult of the Canaanites, and therefore were indistinguishable from them. That is why Herodotus, a Greek historian of the 5th century BC, discusses the Phoenicians and the Syrians of Palestine, who practiced circumcision. He further mentioned that these people have a tradition that in ancient times they lived on the Persian Gulf, but migrated to the Syrian coast, where they are found today. This part of Syria, together with the country which extends southward to Egypt, is all known as Palestine. Greece was supposedly founded, according to Greek legend, by a Phoenician named Danos. Hecates of Abdera, a Greek historian of the 4th century BC, set out his view that the traditions of the Israelite Exodus and that of Danos were parallel versions of the same story. Referring to the Egyptians, he said, the natives of the land surmised that unless they removed the foreigners, their troubles would never be resolved. At once, therefore, the aliens were driven from the country, and the most outstanding and active among them branded together, and, as some say, were cast ashore in Greece and certain other regions. Their teachers were notable men, among them Danius and Cadmus, but the greater number were driven into what is now called Judea, which is not far from Egypt, and at that time was utterly uninhabited. The colony was headed by a man called Moses. Continued Jewish and Kabbalistic influence was significant in the development of a Greek philosophy. A prime example was the philosopher Pythagoras. It was commonly believed that Pythagoras had been a student of the Magi in Babylon. It was through him that the cult of Orpheus, known as Orphism, was transmitted to thinkers like Plato. Orphism was a cult of a Greek version of the dying god Dionysus. According to Heraclitus, who wrote in the 6th century BC, the rites of Dionysus were in imitation of those Magi. Ancient Jewish historians had long recognized the Jewish origin for Orphism. Leading writers in this vein were Aristobulus, Artapanus, Eupolemus, Cleodamus, Artapanus, a 3rd century BC Jewish philosopher, declared of Moses that as a grown man, he was called Musaeus by the Greeks. This Musaeus was the teacher of Orpheus. Aristobulus, a 3rd century BC Jewish philosopher, also claimed that Orpheus was a follower of Moses. Similarly, Aristobulus maintained that Plato had come into contact with Jewish thought. It is evident that Plato imitated our legislation and that he had investigated thoroughly each of the elements in it, for it had been translated by others before Demetrius Valerius, before the conquest of Alexander and the Persians. The parts concerning the exodus of the Hebrews, our fellow countrymen, out of Egypt, the fame of all things that happened to them, the conquest of the land, and the detailed account of the entire legislation. So it is very clear that the philosopher mentioned above took many things from it, for he was very learned, as was Pythagoras, who transferred many of our doctrines and integrated them into his own beliefs. Evidence of Kabbalistic ideas is found particularly in the Timaeus and the Republic of Plato. Essentially, Plato has long been regarded as the great godfather of the Kabbalah. The same has continued to be claimed by leading Kabbalists throughout the century. Leon Hebreo, the key representative of the Italian Kabbalists of the Renaissance, saw Plato as a disciple of the ancient Kabbalah. Other Kabbalists, such as Isaac Abravanel and Rabbi Yohanan Alamano, believed Plato to have been a disciple of Jeremiah in Egypt. On the similarity of the teachings of the Greek philosophers and the Kabbalah, Rabbi Abraham Yagel commented, "This is obvious to anyone who has read what is written on the philosophy and principles of Democritus, and especially on Plato, the master of Aristotle, whose views are almost those of the sages of Israel, and who on some issues almost seems to speak from the very mouth of the Kabbalists and in their language, without any blemish on his lip. And why shall we not hold these views? Since they are ours, inherited from our ancestors by the Greeks, and down to this day, great sages hold the views of Plato, and great groups of students follow him, as is well known to anyone who has served the sage of the academy and entered their studies, which are found in every land. It is Plato's Republic which has provided the basis for the modern New World Order project. He foresaw the establishment of a dictatorship governed by an enlightened elite, which he called philosopher kings. When asked in what these philosopher kings will be instructed in at the end of the Republic, Plato provides the myth of Ur. While there are numerous examples of Kabbalistic or Magian influence in Plato, it is in this myth that he describes a vision that is most replete with such examples. Colotes, a philosopher of the 3rd century BC, accused Plato of plagiarism, maintaining that he substituted Ur's name for that of Zoroaster. Clement of Alexandria and Proclus quote from a work entitled On Nature, attributed to Zoroaster, in which he is equated with Ur. Quoting the opening of the work, Clement mentions, Zoroaster then writes, "These things I wrote, I, Zoroaster, the son of Armenius, a Pamphylian by birth, having died in battle and been in Hades, hell, that is. I learned them of the gods. This Zoroaster," Plato says, "having been placed on the funeral pyre, rose again to life in 12 days. He alludes perchance to the resurrection, or perchance to the fact that the path for souls to ascension lies through the 12 signs of the zodiac. And he himself says that the descending pathway to birth is the same. In the same way, we are to understand the 12 labors of Hercules, after which the soul obtains release from this entire world." In Plato can be found many of the nefarious policies that have been pursued by the New World Order elite, including the elimination of marriage and the family, compulsory education, the use of eugenics by the state, and the employment of deceptive propaganda methods. According to Plato, all these women shall be wives in common to all the men, and not one of them shall live privately with any man. The children, too, should be held in common, so that no parent shall know which is his own offspring, and no child shall know his parent. This belief is associated with a need for eugenics, as the best men must cohabit with the best women in as many cases as possible, and the worst with the worst and the fewest, and that the offspring of the one must be reared and that of the other not, if the flock is to be as perfect as possible. More pernicious still is this prescription for infanticide. The offspring of the inferior and any of those of the other sort who are born defective they will properly dispose of in secret, so that no one will know what has become of them. That is the condition of preserving the purity of the guardian's breed. Compulsory schooling is to be implemented in order to separate children from their parents, to have them indoctrinated in the ideals of the state. They, talking about the philosopher kings, will begin by sending out into the country all the inhabitants of the city who are more than 10 years old, and will take possession of their children, who will be unaffected by the habits of their parents. These they will train in their own habits and laws. I mean, in the laws which we have given them. And in this way, the state and constitution of which we were speaking will soonest and most easily attain happiness. And the nation which has such a constitution will gain most. As for propaganda, according to Plato, our rulers will find a considerable dose of falsehood and deceit necessary for the good of their subjects. He further explains, rhetoric is a producer of persuasion for belief, not for instruction in the matter of right and wrong. And so the rhetorician's business is not to instruct a law court or a public meeting in matters of right and wrong, but only to make them believe. Since, I take it, he could not in a short while instruct such a mass of people in matters so important. So I'm going to hold up there, but this is essentially history and going all the way back to Sumeria and the history of the Israelites and how this God Allah was revealed. Anyway, we'll hold up there, and I'll pick up a little bit later when the lighting's a little bit better. Night comes, she cloaks the world in impenetrable darkness, and suddenly a chill rises from the ground, and life takes on new meaning. Namaste, namaskaram.